guys, so here we go. You're going to need your notes that I handed you, and what you're going to do is fill in the blanks as I talk to you about each slide. If you get stuck or get lost, just go ahead and stop the video and start back over and listen to it again. It'll be a great review for you. So we're going to start with cell structure. So find that at the top of your sheet. Alright guys, so a cell is the smallest unit that is capable of performing life functions. Alright, so the cell is the absolutely smallest thing that can actually still be alive. It can do things, it can do all the things that we do just in a much simpler form. And of course we've got trillions of cells in our body all doing the functions that we do as one big organism. So you can't get anything smaller than a cell and still be alive. Alright, all cells have an outer covering called a cell membrane. This kind of keeps the cell together, just like we have a skin. Otherwise, all our stuff would just fall out everywhere. The cells have to have the same thing. And inside that cell is a jelly-like material called cytoplasm. And cytoplasm is basically like jello, and it suspends all the other parts inside the cell to keep them where they need to be. Alright, and in the cytoplasm of every cell is hereditary material that controls the life of the cell. So as simple a cell you can find, if it's a real cell, it's going to have genetic material, which is basically a big old blueprint for that cell that controls its life. It's going to be in there. Alright guys, so cells can be all shapes, all sizes, and have entirely different things inside them. They have to all have that cytoplasm, like I said, and a cell membrane and that genetic code. But other than that, they can be very different. So we have nerve cells that can be a meter long, which is about 3 feet. So that's a single cell 3 feet long. However, most cells are a lot tinier than that. For example, a human egg cell is no bigger than the dot on an eye. So if you wrote an eye on your paper, okay, is no bigger than that dot. And then we also have human red blood cells. We've already talked about that last semester, about what red blood cells do. Remember, they provide the oxygen to the cell, and they're only 1/10 the size of that dot, so they're even smaller. Alright, and even smaller than that is a bacteria cell, or what's called a bacterium. 8,000 of the smallest bacteria can fit inside one of your red blood cells. So if you took the dot on your eye, split it into 10 parts, you could stuff 8,000 of those bacteria cells inside that. Alright, so or 80,000 of them could fit in the side of that dot of your eye. Okay, now cells, the reason why some cells are so small and some cells are so big really kind of go along with what do they do. Some cells, what they do requires a large cell, and other cells need to be very, very tiny. So going along with what different cells do. Okay, you remember we talked about 6 kingdoms. Well, and we talked about bacteria being kind of 2 kingdoms, or in one, or actually 2 different domains, and then all the other organisms are in a different domain. Well, this is what caused that whole hullabaloo. Alright, so scientists found there's 2 kinds of cells. Basically, we have cells with just some genetic code and that's it inside there. That's called prokaryotic cells, and those are bacterial cells. So the bacteria that's in you, the bacteria found in the volcano, the archaebacteria, both of those basically just have some goo inside a membrane with the genetic code and some basic little stuff inside. Alright, and then you've got all the other kinds of cells. So cells in plants, cells in animals, cells in fungi, and protists, which are still single cells but far more complicated. All of those are considered eukaryotic, and that's because they have a nucleus that kind of holds that DNA all together, that genetic code. Instead of it being kind of just wherever in a prokaryotic cell, it's kind of bound up inside the middle of the eukaryotic cell. And then there's also all these other little parts inside the cell that have very specific functions. Alright, so some cells have what's called a cell wall, and that's made out of cellulose, and it gives a lot of shape and structure, protects the cells, and it grows and helps that cell or helps that organism get very large. We find these in plants, algae, fungi, and several bacteria do also have cell walls. It's much more rigid than the cell membrane. Okay, think cell membrane is going to be soft, and then a cell wall is going to be hard. They're tough, rigid outer coverings that protect the cell and give it shape. Plant cells all have these. This is why a tree can grow to 80 feet tall and not just flop over. Okay, that animal cells don't have cell walls, which is why we're limited in how big we can actually get. Alright, so we have the cell wall on the very outside. If you're a plant, fungi, some protists, algae, some bacteria. Okay, now all cells, like we said before, have a cell membrane. That's next. That's that softer protective layer, kind of like our skin is soft versus the bark on a tree. That'd be more an example of a cell wall. This cell membrane is around all kinds of cells. If you're a cell, you have a cell membrane, like we said. And it's permeable. It lets things in and out of the cell, just like our skin allows sweat out. Okay, and it actually gets some oxygen in. Those cells on the very outer surface of your skin do take in oxygen. Okay, so do cell membranes. They let stuff in and out. And if cells have cell walls, they still have the cell membrane inside it. The cell membrane, what it does is it allows food and oxygen into the cell, and it allows waste out of the cell. As we studied the human body, remember we talked about that, especially the lung cells. They have to let the oxygen in and the CO2 out. Otherwise, if the cell can't get rid of things, then it's going to obviously be poisoned by all those toxins and waste products, and it won't survive, which would be bad news for us. Alright, and then previously we just talked about cytoplasm, so here it is again. It's that jello-like substance called cytoplasm that's inside the cell membrane. Alright, and some cells also have what's considered a cytoskeleton. Okay, so cyto obviously has to do with inside the cell. We have cytoplasm, so the plasma is that gooey stuff on the inside. And then, of course, skeleton. Okay, just like our skeletons are hard, those cytoskeletons are also pretty rigid, and they provide that structure in that cytoplasm which helps the cell keep its shape. Just like our skeleton helps us keep our shape, so we're not just a bag of meat. The cytoskeleton helps the cell keep its shape so it just doesn't kind of ooze and not be able to do anything. Alright, so within that cytoplasm of eukaryotic cells, remember eukaryotic means it has a nucleus, they also have all these other organelles, kind of like we have organs that do functions. Remember the liver, the heart, the kidneys, the brain, all those things are organs in our body helping us stay alive, doing a certain job. Well, these little organelles do the same thing for a cell. So it's just on a smaller scale. So some organelles process energy just like our bodies do, right? The digestive system, all those organs in the digestive system help us process our food, which creates energy. Other organelles manufacture substances needed, just like various organs in our body makes different things, like the bone marrow and the bones make the blood, the oxygen gets provided by our lungs, and all those things. So again, they're just tiny organs for the cells. Most organelles are surrounded by membranes to kind of hold them together, just like our stomach has kind of a skin around it to hold it together, and so on. And the biggest clue to the easiest to spot organelle is the nucleus. It's usually the largest. Sometimes in plants that won't be the case, but for the most part, nucleuses, or nuclei, I should say, are the biggest organelle. They're the control center, they're the most important, so they're the biggest. Alright, so speaking of the nucleus, it directs all cells' activities and are separated by the cytoplasm by a membrane. It is the brain of the cell. It's the control center. It tells that cell what it's going to do, how it's going to do it, and how long. The nucleus contains the instructions for everything the cell does. So again, it is the control center. It provides that cell with everything it needs as far as what it's going to do, how it's going to replicate itself, how's it going to, do this, do that, do whatever it needs to do. Alright, and the reason why the nucleus is the control center is because it has this long thread-like hereditary material called DNA. And we've talked about DNA before. It's basically a huge long string of code that basically determines what that cell's structure and what it's going to do is all about. The structure called the nucleolus is also found in the nucleus. You can see a picture here of the DNA. It's a cool double-stranded helix, what they call a helix. And it's amazing what it does. And we're going to talk about that later as we get into DNA and genetics and all that good stuff. Alright, so now we don't just have a nucleus, we also have all these energy processing organelles. It's a huge job. Without energy, the cell dies. So these organelles help the cells do what they need to do. They just like food helps us do what we need to do. If we didn't eat, we'd be too tired to do anything, whether it's what we want to do or have to do. Well, same for the cells. They have certain organelles that help them do what they got to do so they can do their job. So plant cells, right? Remember, plants make their own food using sunlight and oxygen or CO2 and water. Okay, and the reason why they can do that, remember guys, what color is plants? Green. Okay, plants are green for a reason, and the reason why is because they have these green organelles in all their cells called chloroplasts. And what chloroplasts do is basically do that job of making food. They take its chlorophyll, which is what gives it that green color, and it absorbs the sunlight. It takes in that CO2, combines that with the water, and voila, the plant has its own energy to use, and we call that process photosynthesis. Alright, so what does the plant do and what do we do when we have energy and need it to store it for later? Okay, well, we store it in something called the mitochondria. The mitochondria, if you look, it kind of looks like almost like how our small intestine looks, right? Lots of squiggly surface area on the inside, covered by a capsule. Almost, some students say it looks like a house shoe, but anyway, that's just a cutaway so you can see the inside. But our energy is stored inside this mitochondria, and it holds it until we need it later on. So we call it the powerhouse of the cell. It's the energy center, and it basically breaks down food into carbon dioxide and water, and that makes the energy for all our cells. Alright, so remember back in the dawn of the ages of this school year when we talked about carbs and protein and fats? Well, this is where proteins come into play. Okay, proteins are part of the cell membranes. Other proteins are needed for chemical reactions that take place in the cytoplasm. Okay, so that's why we need protein, because our cells need it to do things. And so cells basically, our body breaks down those proteins into pieces so that our cells can make their own proteins using ribosomes. So the ribosomes basically piece those pieces together to make those proteins for the cell. Alright, so we also have to process, transport, and store things in the cell. So we have what's called the endoplasmic reticulum. I'll say that again, endoplasmic reticulum. Of course, we're going to shorten it and call it the ER, not the emergency room, but the ER for endoplasmic reticulum. And it's basically a highway as it extends from the nucleus to the cell membrane. So it goes from the center of the cell all the way out to the outer limits of the cell, that cell membrane. And it's basically a bunch of folded, smooth or rough membranes. Some of them are rough, some of them are smooth. And basically, what it does is it's a big old conveyor belt, and it processes and moves stuff around inside the cell. Okay, so again, the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER, may be rough or smooth. And what determines that is whether or not it has ribosomes. And remember, ribosomes make proteins. And the cell needs proteins all over the place for doing different things. So, let's do a shortcut. The cell's not stupid. It's got ribosomes already attached to some of the endoplasmic reticulum, which makes it rough and bumpy with all those little house shoes. And that kind of allows the proteins to quickly get around the cell to where they're needed. Okay? Now, the ER that doesn't have those ribosomes attached, ER that moves other required things around the cell, that's going to be smooth because the ribosomes aren't attached and they're not bumpy. Alright, so after proteins are made in a cell, they're transferred to another type of cell organelle called the Golgi bodies. Golgi bodies. And what they do is they package it and move it out of the cell or into other parts of the cell. So they're basically the UPS system. They package and ship things where they need to go all over the cell so that the cell has it where it needs it. Now, sometimes cells need storage spaces. Okay, the mitochondria stores the energy, but what about other things like water or proteins, things that they don't need right away? Well, it's got a storage system, and what storage system called is a vacuole. Alright, and a vacuole is basically a bubble inside the cytoplasm that's just open for storing anything that the cell needs temporarily. So, such as food, water, waste products, like if it's got a bunch of waste but it can't get rid of it yet, it'll just form a little bubble around it, and that way it won't kill the cell or toxicify the cell until it's ready to get rid of it. Now, plants have really large vacuoles. Think just for a minute, why would a plant maybe have to have really large vacuoles? What is something plants really need to store in case they don't have any of this supply due to drought, hint hint, or something drying up? You got it, it's for water. Plants need very large vacuoles to store water in case of times of no water, because without water, plants can't do photosynthesis and therefore they'll die. Alright, a couple of more organelles. We've got recyclers, and these are called the lysosomes. They basically digest stuff just like we digest food. It breaks down these food molecules, the cell waste, and worn out cell parts, and basically makes them into tiny little building blocks for the cell to reuse as needed. Alright, so now that we've looked at all the cell parts, let's see how the cell kind of fits in with what we know about our cells. Alright, so we know we've got cells. We've got a bunch of cells inside us. Well, as we've talked about at the beginning of last semester, a group of cells together is called tissue. And basically any group of cells that perform one job or one kind of thing we call tissues. And then those tissues all work together to do a bigger version of that job, and we call those organs, like your heart, brain, and so on. Alright, so that organ is a structure of two or more different types of tissues that work together. So like your heart is made up of cardiac muscle tissue, some nerve tissue, and blood tissues all working together to pump blood. Alright guys, so when you have a bunch of organs working together to do an even bigger job, we call that an organ system. So for example, remember back when we were talking about the cardiovascular system? Well, that was one system working to move blood around the body. So we had the heart, veins, arteries, blood, all those kinds of things working together to do one job, which is to move nutrients and oxygen around your body. Alright, so quick little quiz. Which of these two cells is a bacterial cell? Is it the prokaryotic cell or the eukaryotic cell? Think back. Which cell only had some DNA just kind of oozing around in the center. Think, what would make sense? Would it make sense for bacterial cells to be simple, or would it make sense for everything else to be simple? So let's see if you got it right. If you answered prokaryotic cells are in bacteria, you are correct. So ding, 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 pat on the back for you. All right, so question 2, which part of the cell protects the cell and gives it shape? Cell walls. Remember, these are hard, rigid coatings that kind of give it a shape and structure, make it a lot stronger than it would be normally. Okay, animals do not have these. This is why we're kind of limited in how big we can get versus trees. Unless, I know Mr. Cosper's tall, but he's not the size of an 80-foot redwood tree. So he can't be any taller because he has no cell wall. Okay, third question. In what part of the cell is the cytoskeleton found? And let's see, if you said it's in the cytoplasm, you would be correct. Okay, it's that structure, that scaffolding that gives that cytoplasm some stiffness to it so that the cell can maintain its shape regardless if it has a cell wall or not. Alright, so you're going to be seeing lots and lots of cells in the microscope. Okay, because they're so tiny. Remember I said how 8,000 bacterial cells could be found in 1/10 of the dot of your eye? Well, okay, that's going to be really, really hard to see. So we have something handy dandy called a microscope that's going to allow us to see that because it blows up that picture to something that we can see with our eye. Okay, so microscopes have only been around for about 500 years. The first one was made by this Dutch person who made reading glasses because people were blind even back then and wanted to read and they couldn't. So this gentleman decided to make a microscope. Okay, and later on, a gentleman named Antoine van Leeuwenhoek. That's a fun name, Leeuwenhoek. Anyway, the mid 1600s, he's only a fabric merchant, but he made a simple microscope with a tiny glass bead for a lens. It was very, very simple, nothing like today's. Okay, so what do we mean by simple? It means that basically it has just one lens. Now, the ones we're going to use are a bit more exciting. They're called compound microscopes because they have two lenses and they're going to use light to create the image. So that's why Ms. Cosper has to plug them up because they need a light to work. Otherwise, you see a whole bunch of nothing. Okay, so after chemists heard about the microscope for the cells, okay, they got jealous and excited because atoms are even tinier than cells. They're absolutely probably the tiniest thing that we can think of, except their parts. And so they had to invent something called an electron microscope. And instead of using lenses to direct beams of light, they use this magnetic field to direct beams of electrons. So super high tech, super expensive, so not going to be in this classroom. But if you decide to go into science in college and university, you may get to use one, and that's pretty neat. Alright, so people weren't aware of cells since the dawn of time. It actually came about once the microscope was invented. People actually saw that there were such a thing as cells. And so slowly over time, this idea of cell theory was developed. So, looking at Robert Hooke, not Leeuwenhoek, but this other guy, Robert Hooke, in 1665, he went and cut a thin slice of cork. Cork is part of a tree. It's got lots of holes in it. You find it in wine bottles. It floats. Anyway, he cut a thin slice of it and threw it under the microscope because that's what scientists did back then because nobody knew anything. So they just looked at a bunch of stuff. And when he looked at it in the microscope, he said, wow, there's all these empty little boxes. And he thought, monks and nuns live in empty little boxes, and we call those cells, so I'm going to call it a cell. Alright, so nothing much else happened after Robert Hooke's discovery with the little tiny monk cells inside a cork. People just knew that they kind of existed, but in the 1830s, Matthias Schleiden used a microscope to study plants and concluded that all plants are made of cells. So he took a work, came before him 200 years, and decided, I'm going to see if all plants have cells. And he found, yes, they do. Now, besides him was Theodor Schwann, and he did the same thing but with animal cells, and he concluded that all animals are made up of cells. So between the two of them, they figured out that all plants and all animals have cells, and so they thought, well, that's pretty much every living thing, so we think every living thing has cells in it. So, that was pretty big news in the scientific world and stunned people. And then several years later, because this guy had a hard to pronounce name, so he decided to make himself famous, so we'd all have a hard time saying his name, Rudolf Virchow, he hypothesized that cells divide to form new cells. So if plants have cells and animals have cells, how do they get those cells? Well, they divide in half and grow those two halves to make new cells. And so his observations and conclusions and those of everybody else beforehand is called cell theory. So we have three basic sentences to go with cell theory. 1. Cells are the basic unit of all living things. 2. All living things have one or more cells in them. And 3. New cells come from old cells through cell division, which simply means they divide and grow. Now, we also sometimes hear about viruses, and we kind of think of viruses as alive because they attack us and make us sick and miserable, and we get mad and have to go to the doctor and get shots. Not fun times. Well, but that's where the big debate is. Okay, because a virus is simply just a strand of some DNA surrounded by a protein coating. They don't have a nucleus, they don't have any organelles, they don't even have a cell membrane. They do have a variety of shapes because all they are is that protein coating and some DNA. Now, viruses can make copies of themselves. That's why we all get sick. But they can't do that without using a cell. When we call that the host cell. So basically they invade the cell and use it to make copies of themselves. Okay, and we can actually crystallize some of these viruses and they can be stored for years. Okay, so how does a virus actually copy itself? Well, a virus lands, and you can kind of look on the picture, it kind of looks like a freaky spidery looking thing with a green top and purple legs, but it basically lands on the cell and destroys it by making a bunch of itself. Now, some viruses can be latent, which means they kind of just hang out. They inject their DNA into a host cell, and it just kind of sits there for a while. It doesn't go to work right away making more viruses. Okay, it just kind of sits there and copies the DNA and does nothing else. So the cell's just chugging along, doing what it's going to do, also copying the virus's DNA at the same time. Okay, so some viruses can be latent for a bunch of years, okay, and then all of a sudden certain conditions can activate the virus. So the virus could be, you could have some viruses inside you and you would never know because it's just sitting there biding its time, making extra DNA, and then one day it gets a signal to go kapow and get started. So for example, if you have a cold sore on your lip, that was actually formed by a latent virus that suddenly became active. So your immune system maybe was suppressed because you got a cold, which is why they're called cold sores, or something else happened and triggered that virus to go into action and actually begin making you miserable. So, as if we didn't know, how do viruses affect organisms besides maybe just making us sick? Okay, viruses attack everything. They attack animals, plants, fungi, protists, and all types of bacteria, both archaebacteria and eubacteria. Now, viruses often can only affect certain kinds of cells. So a lot of, let's say, viruses that may affect dogs and cats and rodents may not affect us, but some can. It just depends on the virus. So again, viruses can be limited to one host species or one type of tissue within that species. So some viruses may only affect the heart, or the lungs or the skin and not the rest of your body. Okay, there are a few viruses that can affect a broad range of hosts. For example, EPM or West Nile virus that can infect more than just humans. It can infect birds, it can infect horses. So it just depends on the virus. Now, viruses cannot move by themselves, but they can reach a host body different ways. Okay, so viruses don't actually move and walk around, but they do get passed on from host to host in different ways. One, it can be on a plant surface by the wind or inhaled by an animal. Okay, often that happens, which is why we cover our nose when we sneeze, because those viruses get blown out into the atmosphere, and if you're nearby, guess what? It goes directly into you. Okay, now, in a viral infection, the virus first attaches to the surface of the host cell. It lands on that cell. Then, as you can see in the picture, once it lands in the cell, it attaches to these enzymes, okay, that it needs to recognize. And that's why it can only often attack one kind of cell, because it's almost like a key fitting into a lock. If the key isn't the right one, it won't work, and so it won't be successful. Alright, so when we get attacked by viruses, obviously we want to fight them because we don't want them destroying our cells. So we have what's called a vaccine. Thankfully, that was invented, and what they did was they discovered that vaccines are made if they take weakened virus pieces that cannot cause a disease. So like the flu vaccine is from weakened flu pieces. It can't actually give you the flu. But what it does is it kind of creates a most wanted poster for your body. Remember those white blood cells that attack stuff? Well, those pieces kind of trigger your white blood cells to recognize that virus so that if it enters your body, it knows to immediately attack it and kill it before it can start attacking your cells. So, vaccines have been made to prevent many diseases, including measles, mumps, smallpox, chickenpox, polio, and rabies. We've also now got shingles vaccines, we've got flu vaccines, and all those are extremely important so that you can not get sick from all these horrible diseases. Alright, so who created that first vaccine? Who can we thank for, having protection against the flu and mumps and all that? Is Edward Jenner. Okay, and what happened was in 1796, he developed a smallpox vaccine for smallpox because he happened to notice, wow, people who get cowpox, which was a similar disease, don't get smallpox. So when he figured that out, he would take cowpox and take a weakened form of it and inject it in people, and then they didn't get smallpox, and then they didn't have to fear that deadly disease. So that is how we get rid of viruses. Unfortunately, new viruses crop up all the time, and so until new vaccines are made, people still get sick from other viruses because they tend to change shape and mutate pretty rapidly sometimes. So that concludes this PowerPoint presentation. Check your handout, make sure you filled in all the blanks, and if you missed any, go back and listen to it again, and you can hear this amazing rendition of cells and cell theories and cell parts and what the heck is a virus and all that good stuff.